Section 2, The Myth, Chapter 4. So we set up an anti-leaf, Bonner said. There was a place, a node, in my original verbal mask where the development could be attached. The Green Queen is supposed to have certain traditional powers, Bonner explained wearily. She has clairaudience and clairvoyance and cryptaesthesia, for example. He paused and glanced at the Auglinger. How was she taking all the big words? Yes, just as he'd expected. Her jaw was dropped, and she was looking at him blankly. Her expression was always blank. She had remarkably stupid eyes. He sighed. He glossed his own word choice, that the Green Queen is supposed to be able to hear and see things happening at a distance, and to perceive the contents of closed containers and so on. Now, we can't do much in the way of simulating powers like those, but the Green Queen is supposed to be able to kill with a gesture of the hand, to be able to revive and restore by a touch. We can approximate these gifts artificially. That's why it's so important for you to learn to manipulate, and manipulate skillfully, the rods hidden under your clothes. You understand? The Auglinger looked at him doubtfully. After a moment she nodded, though even more doubtfully her carroty head. Yes, I guess. Good. Try it again. This time, the long spark. Caroline Auglinger glanced at him nervously. With a good deal of wriggling, she managed to get her plump white hand down inside the waist-high slits of her embroidered robe. More wriggling. A series of body bumps. A moment of painful expectation, while she visibly felt along the row of controls in the front of her dress. Then, at long last, from her stiffly outstretched left hand, there shot out a feeble spark. You're using the wrong hand, Boomer said patiently. You must stretch out your right hand and work the controls with the left. Oh, I thought I was using my left. Once more, Caroline Auglinger, Green Queen anti-leaf, fumbled inside her robe. A nimbus appeared around her head and then flickered off again. There was another pause, long, painful, expectant. The Auglinger's milky skin grew flushed. From the end of her extended right hand, a long blue spark shot out. It was a good, powerful-looking spark, quite the best she had yet produced. Bonner wanted to applaud. The spark hung in the air for a minute. Slowly it began to sag down in a paling, dispirited arc. Before it could touch the floor or disappear entirely, it seemed to correct itself and shot back up Caroline Auglinger's wrist. The woman uttered a sharp, surprised cry. Oh, I've stung myself. Bonner felt no desire to laugh. This had happened a number of times before. No doubt it would happen several times yet again. Yes, he said. He put his hands over his eyes. You'd better rest. Caroline Auglinger relaxed. From the unnatural, ramroddy stiffness her body took on when she was trying to impersonate the Queen, her normal slump posture reappeared. She sat down in the chair with a thump. Thank you, she said. Bonner took his hands down from his eyes and looked at her. Why did he dislike her so? She was reasonably young, not impossibly bad-looking, and yet he continually felt an intensity of dislike that, from a male to a female, was surprising. The more he attempted to train her in a role, the more he resented her. Partly, of course, it was because she simply wasn't Leaf. He found that he was unconsciously trying to make her behave as Leaf would have behaved, and when she showed herself recalcitrant and inept, his dislike of her increased. But there was more to it than that. Would she do for the Green Queen at all? She had to. She was all they had, and they had trained her carefully. They had dieted her to make her lose weight, exercised her to make her less flabby. Experts had worked painstakingly on her diction, her bearing, her voice. But no training could disguise the tawdriness of her spirit. It was incurable. It shone through every improvement they imposed on her, and rendered the changes ludicrous. Whatever they did, she remained a silly, vapid woman dressed up for a queen. Would she do for the queen? Perhaps. From a distance, with the light coming from an angle, with all the prestige of the government behind her, she might pass, and if she weren't too closely confronted with Leaf. Suddenly Bonner felt that he couldn't stand any more of her. The situation was growing serious. Reports that the Green Queen had showed herself downstairs were increasing in number and detail with every hour. Time was valuable, but right now, for now, he couldn't stand any more ogling her. He'd have to have a rest from her, if it was only for a couple of hours. "We'll have a recess," he said to the woman. "I'll call the guards." "Oh!" Her doughy face lit up. The only animation she had ever shown, from the first moment she had been brought to the tower, the government fort in the center of Shalom, had come at the times he was dismissing her. "That will be nice." The only animation? No. That wasn't entirely true. Not quite fair to the ogling her. She had shown animation, interest, excitement even, when it came to embroidering the robes she was to wear as queen. And she had done a beautiful job. All that was best in Caroline ogling her came out in her embroidering. She had embroidered a fantasy, pure and lovely in tender shades of spring-like green. Jade, emerald, neophyte, and a dozen tones between had been in her needle's palette. Between the fantastic shades of green she had set touches of turquoise and robin's egg blue, and finally there were flowers of strange, flat, pinky beige. The robes of a queen. Even on Caroline herself they looked well. How would they have looked on Leaf? Bonner sighed. He pressed the buzzer. To the guards when they entered he said, "Take this lady to her rooms." Meditatively he watched the queen candidate's broad back as it retreated down the corridor. The idea of Caroline's robes had started a train of thought which it seemed somehow important to pursue. Her lack of animation, her interest in her embroidering. Oh, now he had it. The idea that had been eluding him. It was the difficulty they had had with Caroline, their failure finally to make her believe that she was the Green Queen. It had been decided almost without argument that she would give a better performance in her role if she were convinced that the role were true. The first visit to her narrow, crowded, ill-smelling body servant's lodging had had the character of an annunciation. The visitors, Bonner had been among them, had bowed to her and addressed her deferentially. They had spoken to her in glowing terms of her future, and Caroline had looked at them slyly out of her doughy face, with her flat eyes, and refused to believe. They had tried hypnosis. For a moment, Bonner thought longingly of the psychological techniques of faraway Earth. On Earth, though it was legally forbidden, it was possible to make anyone believe anything. But Viridis was, as a Rockefeller man had once said, 200 years behind the times, and a backwater to boot. Hypnosis was very nearly all they had. When hypnosis had failed, they had tried direct suggestion, argument, and veridical mask art. It had all been futile. Less suggestible as well as less intelligent than Leaf, Caroline had remained stubbornly aware that her betters were using her for their own ends. Why had the hypnosis failed? The hypnotist himself had said that what they had been trying to get Caroline to believe conflicted too deeply with her picture of herself. Caroline saw herself as pitiable, wrong, weak, abused. That she showed considerable aggressiveness in marketing her sufferings did not change the pattern basically. If she were the queen, she would no longer be pitiable, so she could not believe that she was the queen. But might there not be something else? an equally valid, if less penetrating, reason for her disbelief. Yes. Bonner's lips tightened. The Oglinger might refuse to believe that she was the Green Queen if she thought the Green Queen was somebody else. Bonner remained standing for a moment, thinking. Then he buzzed intelligence and gave instructions. Their gist was that while Caroline Oglinger was to be allowed free egress from the tower, all her actions and contacts were to be carefully watched. He sat down at his desk. From the big range of windows in front of him, he had a view high up over the capital's broad, tree-lined streets. He could see nearly the whole city. He was an important man in the government now, with a suite of rooms almost at the top of the tower. His day in verbal mask seemed to be over. Sometimes he felt a little lonely for them. His rise had come about easily, naturally, and it appeared in retrospect inevitably. At the clarifying interview, he had used his surmises to answer the questions and to gather more information from what he was asked. There had been other interviews with more important persons. His old intimacy with Leaf had stood him in good stead. He had managed to parlay that and what he had surmised and guessed up into an insight that must have seemed almost uncanny to his questioners. In the end, he had had a complete, even detailed knowledge of what the government feared, of what it had attempted and why it had failed. And when Leaf had disappeared, they had put him in charge of training anti-Leaf. For a long time he had learned that tensions in Viridarian social life had been increasing. Punitive measures against the lores were only temporarily effective. The sum total of lore discontent always increased. Discontent not only with the precociousness of their lives, which one could understand though not forgive, but also discontent with their own idleness and uselessness. That, as every upper knew, was entirely the lower's own fault. They had a task in society to perform. They could perform it, if they only would. On the other hand, a number of uppers, misguided, sentimental, or merely destructive, who wanted to make a basic change in Viridarian society, was increasing too. The government had reason to suspect that the cult of the apple-pickers was a focus for people like these. It had seemed a brilliant, if possibly overbold idea to use the mask about the Green Queen that Bonner had promulgated to draw both groups, the rebellious lowers and the reforming uppers, out into the open, where the government could sterilize the infection and deal with the dissidents radically. Yes, a brilliant idea. Bonner had been impressed when he had learned about it, but it hadn't worked. Leaf, of course, had been the heart of the plan. Green Queen, mistress of Viridia in her own eyes, she was to have been in reality the government's puppet, or more accurately, the government's Judas sheep. What would have become of her, Bonner wondered, if the plan had worked? Would she have been allowed to go on living after she led her docile followers into the government's grasp? But only at first had she played the part assigned to her. She had joined the apple-pickers in her emotional reaction to Bonner's breaking with her. She had passed the initiatory test triumphantly, and had become genuinely interested in the teachings of the cult. They were egalitarian and mystic. Bonner understood. Sometimes on the surface of Viridis, the apple-pickers believed there was a wonderful tree whose fruit, given to all to eat, would make human beings so free and wise and good that they would be like gods. Such a teaching could easily be brought into harmony with Bonner's mask about the Green Queen and her golden tree of life. But the next step no one had been able to get Leaf to take. Odick, the government spy in the apple-pickers, had never been able to acquire any influence over her. Odick, seated at the desk high above Shellam, Bonner permitted himself a sour smile. What genius, high in the council, had thought Odick could influence anyone? Odick was a typical KG with a shambling gait, accusatory eyes, and unattractive personality KGs always seem to have. To imagine him controlling Leaf was preposterous. But it was true that KGs were oddly apt to acquire influence over people who felt resentful. Their own intense resentment at having been KGs seemed to act as a psychic bond with the others. Perhaps it had been assumed that Leaf would be feeling so resentful at Bonner's desertion of her that Odick would be able to act on her. Bonner picked up the latest sheaf of reports and rifled through them. They all dealt with Leaf's appearance below stairs, the usual miracles, levitation, hearing a lower who was almost dead with the lesions, cryptothesia. One dealt with the government's agent's attempts to assassinate. He had failed. The reports were detailed and clear, just as Bonner had expected. He put them down again. They brought up the question he never could answer quite satisfactorily. Was Leaf really the Green Queen? He himself had made up the mask about the Queen. The Green Queen was the mother of Viridis, the source of all Viridian life. She had gone away when her creatures had been disobedient. But when she saw how much her children were suffering in her absence, she would come again. She would lower the barrier, make the surface of the planet habitable, give all her offspring the fruit of the tree of life to eat. In the end, she would meet her divine consort beside the golden tree. The divine marriage would be consummated, and life in Viridis would be wonderful, a paradise, a dream. He had made up the mask about the Green Queen himself. No, Leaf couldn't be the Green Queen, but that meant that there must be somebody behind Leaf in the same way that he himself was behind Caroline. Who had been behind Leaf when she had stopped the Feyerdon? He wasn't going to let himself think about that. Somebody behind Leaf would imply an organization, well-organized conspiracy, with scientific resources equal to those of the government, and intelligence had never found a trace of anything like that. But what alternative was there? An individual supporting Leaf, manipulating her? But the miracles would be quite beyond the scope of an individual, and even if they weren't, who could the individual be? Orville had disappeared. The reports on Leaf mentioned only followers with her, but the only one who seemed to be consistently present was Odick. Odick was a spy, a turncoat, a deserter. To imagine him as a cunning manipulator was ridiculous. Could one of the big foundations be supporting her? They were supposed never to intervene in domestic or planetary matters, but their studies, surveys, and reports constituted themselves a very considerable interference, as most practical politicians realized. Was it possible that one of the foundations was going further and fomenting a revolution directly? Possible, but unlikely. Surely intelligence would have discovered it. Bonner looked at his dial. There was a council meeting he supposed he would have to attend, and then more work with Auglinger. He was at this moment one of the most powerful men in the government. It was odd how little satisfactions the knowledge brought. It was late when he got back from the meeting. He switched on the lights in his office and looked about him, sighing. The meeting had been confused, nervous, unconstructive. The head of the secret police had expressed doubt about the reliability of some of his men. There was a new bunch of reports on his desk. Bonner picked them up. He had not read 4 words of the first one before he was pressing a button. His brows were knitted in a furious frown. His mouth was grim. He had rarely been so angry. When the Auglinger came, he stood for a moment looking at her. On the wide, soft body, the flat, doughy face. He began to talk. You couldn't offer to surrender to her freely, could you? To throw down the glove honestly. That would have been a matter of principle. No, you couldn't do that. You had to try to make money out of it." Her fingers had gone to her mouth. She looked at him with scared, stupid eyes, and then away again. "Such a little bit of money," Bonner continued. "We heard most of your conversation, you know. The listener heard something about your robe. Are you trying to sell them your robe?" She winced. The shot had gone home. Had Caroline Ogilinger really tried to include that, too, in the deal she had wanted to make with the partisans of Leaf? "Oh, I believe you would," Bonner went on cruelly. "You'd sell your robe to the other queen if you thought she'd pay for it. For sale, one robe, beautifully embroidered, suitable for Green Queen. Is that it? You'd sell your—" A bell on Bonner's desk rang clamorously. A red light had begun to flash. Hastily he jammed the phone to his ear. After a few words his face grew dark. Yes, he said. "Certainly, yes." He hung up. For a second he stood with his hands clasped together behind his back, his head lowered. "She had appeared above the stairs," he said to nobody in particular. The Ogilinger gave a muffled gasp. Bonner looked at her keenly. "You're to get dressed," he told her, "as quickly as possible, but carefully, in the Queen's robes. Remember what I've tried to teach you. When you're dressed, the doctor will give you an injection of bends. Then you're to go to the great square. No, listen, I'm going with you. I'll have a receiver close behind your ear. I'll tell you what to say and do. I'll also have a gun behind your back. Give a good performance, Mrs. Ogilinger. Because if you give a bad one, I'll shoot you. I, or one of the men with me, will have nothing to lose by your death. Do you understand?" Her face had gone pasty gray. She lowered her head. She would not meet his eyes. "Yes," she said. They rode in a bellow car to the edge of the square. Bonner had a small shot of Benz himself. It pleased him to find that he didn't especially need it. As they shot through the yellow-lit night, he felt an emotion that was almost exhilaration. After so much waiting and suspense, such nervous breath-held maneuvering, it was a relief to have the prospect of action at last. However this night ended, the issue would be resolved at last. The great square had always been something of an anomaly in Shalom. Presumably it had been built because the designer of the capital city had felt that the capital was incomplete without a great open-air meeting place. But the modest assemblages of uppers and body servants that had been held in it had never filled it. Its white durstone had always looked a little empty or forlorn. Now in the glare of the yellow floodlights, not only the short flights of steps around the square were packed with people, but almost the entire floor. Volunteers, partisans of Leaf, kept pushing people back from the tiny raised area at one end that was the speaker's dais. Even while Bonner watched, the defensive line bulged and broke, and black dots spilled out over the pavement. But a moment later the line had reformed itself further out in the square. There was a speaker on the dais. From the strange loose gestures and rough unintoned voice, Bonner guessed that it was Odick, even before he picked him up in the field glasses. Bonner's party was too far from the dais for him to get more than a word now and then of Odick's speech, but the KG seemed to be talking about his childhood in the glass cage, his misery, his isolation, his despair. It seemed a strange topic on which to address a crowd that was waiting for a sight of the Green Queen. But perhaps there was some reason for it. Many people in Viridis, Lowers especially, had felt the emotions Odick described. No KG would ever admit that his aseptic rearing in the leaded glass of the cage could have been motivated by a mistaken regard for his welfare, a desire to protect him completely from radioactivity. One and all, KGs were passionately convinced that they had been treated as they had, out of gloating, sadistic cruelty. Caroline Augulinger plucked at Bonner's sleeve. "What are we going to do?" she asked in a thready whisper. There was no reason why she shouldn't know. "We're going into that house," Bonner said. He indicated a darkly looming structure behind them. It was distant almost the length of the square from the dais where Odick stood. "Do you see that topmost balcony? You and I are going out on that." "Oh," the Augulinger said. Bonner sent men into the house. There were voices, protests, soft cries. Once there was a thud like the noise a club makes hitting flesh. In a little while one of Bonner's men came back to say that the house had been evacuated. Bonner and Anti-Leaf went into the house, up out on the balcony. At this height they could hear Odick's voice. Much more clearly, though, the crowd seemed black and anonymous as ants. The door behind them, the balcony into the house, was guarded by Bonner's men. They would help, too, when the moment came. Odick seemed to be getting near the end of his speech. "I felt that I had lost my soul," he boomed. "I was desperate." He made a wide, flapping gesture. KG's always suffered from impaired space perception. "I became a spy for the government. I hated everybody. And then I found my queen, the Green Queen, Queen Leaf. How can I tell you how it feels to get your soul back, to be human? I won't attempt to describe it. You shall see. Queen Leaf." He had finished. He clambered down awkwardly from the dais. Nobody else moved. The dais stood vacant. Then a woman appeared on it. Where had she come from? It was stagecraft, of course. Leaf, after all, had been an apprentice in Veridical. Bonner had a trick or two up his sleeve himself that he had taken over from Veridical. But it had been wonderfully managed, very effective, almost like a miracle. The woman, of course, was Leaf. But was woman quite the right word? It was odd that an impression of majesty, almost divinity, she gave. Bonner fumbled with his field glasses and brought her pale face up close. He was relieved to find how much like the old Leaf she still was. She was smiling a little. She stood quite motionless for a moment. Bonner had time to notice how simple her green robe was, how unlike the heavy impressiveness of what Caroline had embroidered for herself. Then Leaf began to speak. It was a simple speech. Afterwards, Bonner couldn't remember the words she used. She told them that they were unhappy, that she had come to help them, that she would lower the barrier. They need be afraid no longer. She was the Green Queen. She could give them the fruit of her tree to eat. Yes, it was a simple speech. The thousands in the square were utterly silent. People seemed to have stopped breathing. Then a clear voice on the edge of the crowd. It must have been a child's voice. It was so young and pure, said, "Are you really the Green Queen?" "Yes," answered Leaf. Oh, if he had been able to teach Caroline Augulinger to speak like that, dignity and simplicity, and the compelling force of utter truth. For whatever the case might really be, there was no doubt in this moment that Leaf had deeply believed that she was the Queen. Bonner himself had felt a thrill that was almost surrender to belief pass over him in her words. The thousands in the crowd gave into it utterly. A long, low murmur went up from them. It sounded lazy and relaxed, almost somnolent. Then its pitch began to rise. Isolated shouts were heard. It was time. Already Bonner had delayed unduly. Already people nearest the dais were falling on their knees. He picked a speaker that connected to the little receiver behind Caroline Augulinger's ear and spoke into it. "Now," he said. Caroline Augulinger moved forward to the edge of the balcony. She had a heavy shot of bends, and her movements were completely steady and controlled. As she moved forward, Bonner's men turned floodlight on her and brought veridical projectors and lenses into focus. and after a moment she seemed to be standing in a pool of fresh spring-like light against a background of young trees. Heads began to turn toward her. During the last part of Odic's speech, Bonner's men had hooked amplifiers around on the walls of the houses and balconies. Everybody in the square would be able to hear her. "Start talking," Bonner said into the speaker. Anti-Leaf's hands were gripping the rail of the balcony tightly. She hesitated, licking her lips for a fraction of a second. Then, "She is not the Green Queen," she said. It was not quite what she had been supposed to say, but it would do well enough. And her voice, through the amplifiers, had lost the faint edge of querulousness it usually had. "Go on," Bonner prodded. "She is not the Green Queen at all," Caroline repeated. "I am the Queen. That woman is lying to you. She is a trickster. She wants to trick you out of my tree and its fruit." Heads were turning back and forth. The crowd was making comparisons between Leaf and Anti-Leaf. That could be dangerous. Bonner spoke into the microphone hastily. "She has a man with her who confesses he is a spy," Caroline said. "Odic, his name is. Let him come forward to me." Again, it was not quite what Aguilinger had been supposed to say. Bonner frowned. The exact words were important, because they were keyed in with the veridical effects he had wanted to produce. Was Caroline making these mistakes because she was nervous and frightened? Or was it something else? Down at the far end of the square, around the speaker's dais, the crowd was stirring. A man leaped up on the platform beside Leaf. He seemed about to tumble off again, but he maintained his balance, though precariously. It was Odic. "I'll come," he bellowed. "I'll come and face you down. This is a plot, a trick." He jumped down from the platform. Bonner already had him in the field of vision of his glasses. As Odic moved slowly in behind, Bonner pressed a button and turned a stud. Keys and tumblers began to fall in. His previously recorded veridical mask roll began to play. It had been prepared very carefully. Bonner's chief trouble with the mask makers had been to keep them from turning out something effective, something theatrical and spectacular. Bonner had insisted on an Odic only, a little exaggerated, a little caricatured. The projected Odic moved a little more uncouthly than the real one, was a little more loose-lipped and slack-jawed, but the difference made the flesh creep. The projection, of course, was not 100% coordinated with the man. It could not be, in the nature of things. But as Odic pushed his way across the square to the balcony on which Caroline Aguilinger was standing, a low murmur of repulsion went up from the people next to him. "So far, so good." Bonner broke into a weak sweat of relief. If this kept on, Leaf might, after all, be defeated. Rather hesitantly, he pressed another button in the range of those on the belt around his waist. It should have surrounded Odic with an aura of sinister, faintly purplish light, silhouetted his uncouth movements against a lurid, faintly yellowish glow. What really happened was that on the instant the pavement under Odic's feet was replaced by the quaking soil of a viridian marsh, Newt slithered away from his advancing feet. In a clump of coarse-stranded marsh grass near him, the discarded tail segment of a crothalus rattled ominously. Oh, the fools! Somebody had keyed in the wrong roll to that control. Or was it a deliberate sabotage? Bonner switched off the projection on the instant, but some damage had already been done. Someone laughed. "Mask art," a voice said jeeringly. "Does the other queen think she'll fool us with mask art?" Odic had reached the balcony. He stood before it, looking upward. "You are not the queen," he said. His voice was meant to be noble, but it had the unpleasant quality of a deaf person's. Odic, like other KGs, had hardly heard a human voice until he was 6. You are false, a liar. I throw your falsity in your face." Caroline Angulinger threw her head back. For a moment she looked almost majestic. "I will not exchange words with you," said she. "You acknowledge openly that you are a traitor, that you have been a spy. For people like you, there can only be punishment. Here it is." She stretched out her right hand. While she had been speaking, Bonner had given the light surrounding her a reddish tinge. Against that background, a long, bright spark shot out from her hand. It was aimed at Odick, but it died away before it could quite touch him. Nonetheless, its effect on him was remarkable, and, as far as Bonner was concerned, unexpected. Odick's jaw dropped. He looked surprised and a little annoyed, as if he were going to sneeze. His knees bent. He stood for a moment swaying. Then he collapsed sideways on the pavement of the square. He made a kicking motion and was still. "He is dead," announced Caroline Angulinger. Bonner was not cueing her. "So all will die who oppose the true Green Queen." The crowd moved restlessly. The scene it had just witnessed had been dramatic, thrilling, and somehow unconvincing. There was a moment of silence. Then from the far end of the square, Leaf spoke. "You are not dead, Odick," she said. Her voice was perfectly audible even at that distance. "It's an arrangement you've made with her, isn't it? Sit up. I won't buy her robe." There was a pause. Then Odick got stumblingly to his feet. His whole long, hobbledehoy body looked ashamed. "I did it for you," he mumbled sheepishly. "Did you think that I couldn't revive you if you were really dead?" Leaf sighed. "So you pretended. You made an arrangement with her to magnify my power? It wasn't necessary, Odick." Her attention turned to Caroline, who was standing as if frozen, her hands clutching the rail of the balcony. "I can see the rods and wires under your robe," said Leaf, "and the man who is standing behind you with a gun. You are not happy on the balcony. You would rather be at home with your embroidery. I do not know what will become of you, but tell me, don't you, in your heart, know that I am really the queen?" "Yes," answered the Angulinger. She had spoken quickly, involuntarily, before Bonner could dissuade her or prompt her. The word had scarcely left her mouth before she realized what she had done. Her fingers went to her lips. She turned toward Bonner and then cowered away from him again. Don't," she said. Everything was over, ruined, spoiled. Leaf had won. That bitch in front of him had done it. Defeat was bitter in his mouth. Bonner fired. He would have thought it impossible to miss at that distance. But Caroline was bent almost double. The bolt went over her head. She screamed at the noise. Don't, please don't. I'll say anything you want me to say." She made a wild defensive gesture with her hands. Bonner was, after all, not responsible for her death. In her frenzy of motion, her long, heavy embroidered sleeves caught on one of the rods beneath her dress. She pulled against it desperately, still shrieking. Caroline Angulinger had always been inept. To the onlookers, it must have seemed that Bonner fired at her and killed her. What really happened was that, with the aid of the robe she had embroidered, she electrocuted herself. She fell heavily against the railing of the balcony. For a moment it seemed that she would overbalance and go crashing down to the pavement below. Then she collapsed on the inside. She was already dead when Bonner began emptying his gun at her.